Welcome to the Midnight Quilt Show. Tonight, I'm putting a modern twist on a classic block, the 9-patch. Now this episode is actually dedicated to my husband's grandpa who taught me how to quilt. We're gonna take that basic block and make a 9-patch inside a 9-patch inside a 9-patch. Let's get started. Now the pattern I'm actually working with is one that I designed, and it's for free, and you can find the details about it in the description box below. And I'm using these fun pre-cut 2.5-inch strips. It's called the Boundless Briarwood, and I thought it would be a great homage to Grandpa who loved these really traditional prints. Now the best part about these pre-cuts is opening it. We know that I love opening it, that first kind of fun experience of getting ready to get started. So here, I gotta take the rubber band off. Now, I do have one very essential tool close by because for these pre-cuts, I know I'm gonna need this. This is my good old-fashioned lint roller, but we know what happens when we deal with pre-cuts, right? We start looking like we're covered in fuzz, so it's gonna help me keep the mess to a minimum. Look how pretty that is. So the blend of beautiful prints, nice colors, this is definitely something my grandpa would have loved. How fun is that gonna be? And I've got a nice chocolate brown to go with it. This quilt is gonna have a nice scrappy look, which means we're gonna have random prints in random places. So what I'm gonna start is by taking 3 print strips and 2 solid strips to make my first strip unit. So let's do a red. Now Grandpa always said you match colors by sewing them together. To him, a blue was a blue was a blue, but I'm gonna try to at least have the same kind of shades of colors throughout. In fact, the very first quilt I learned how to make was a 9-patch. I had asked him to show me how to make a quilt, and we settled on the 9-patch pattern. So this is kind of very nostalgic, kind of bringing my whole quilting career full circle. Okay, so I'm gonna sew these together and have one big strip unit. So my strip unit's done. Now I gotta cut it into the subunits that are gonna make up my 9-patch. But first I'm going to lint roll some of these little pieces off of my strip and maybe off my shirt, my pants. It's like everywhere. My first strip unit's done, and if you take a peek at the back, you can see that all the seams are nicely pressed, which is kind of funny because Grandpa always told me when I was learning how to sew from him that you don't have to press the seams because they'll just be on the inside of the quilt. And I always wondered why it was so hard to machine quilt them. So I'm gonna trim up my edge, and I'm gonna start cutting these into 2.5-inch strips. Now it's kind of funny because when I learned how to make that very first quilt, sorry, I gotta pay attention to what I'm cutting real quick. It's because I don't even know how to read this ruler. There we go. Got it. Okay, it's funny because when Grandpa was teaching me how to quilt with the first 9-patch, he actually had me use templates. So he gave me 9 square templates and had me cut out each piece of fabric with scissors, and it took forever. So like 2.5 hours later, I had a finished quilt block. And I said, oh look, Grandpa, here's my block. And he said, that looks fantastic. Now let me show you the easy way. And he pulled out his rotary cutter and his ruler. He always was such a trickster. And these are sub-cut from strip units that had 3 solids with 2 prints in between. Okay, so I'm gonna arrange these blocks into my bigger block. So I'm gonna take 1 strip with the 3 prints, with 1 strip with the 3 solids, and continue on until I have a row of 5. And I'm gonna try to rearrange them so it looks as scrappy as possible, but I'm not too worried about it if it's not, exactly what I want it to look like, because once this whole quilt gets done, you're not gonna be able to tell the difference anyway. There we go. Now, you're probably thinking, but Angela, that's not a 9-patch. Just wait for it. You'll see it here in a second. All right, so I've got my blocks set out and I'm gonna start sewing them together. So here's my first block, and I have 3 more already made for a total of 4, just like that. Now let me show you how it comes together. These 4 blocks of 25 pieces are actually gonna be in the corners of our block, and even though they're not actual 9-patches, they're gonna start to form the corners of our bigger 9-patch piece. In the center, I'm gonna go a regular square of our cream fabric, and then I'm gonna put in between them these strips right here. Now these are actually the same strip units I used for the blocks, just cut in 4.5-inch widths. So what happens is when I start putting them in between, I get the bigger block. And again, I'm trying to make it as scrappy and as random as I can make it because I love the look of that kind, and that was Grandpa's style all the way. He loved scrappy. And so here you can tell now it's a 9-patch. I have my 3 rows of 3 blocks. Is it a literal dime patch? No, it's not, but I like it and so would Grandpa, so it stays. So now I'm gonna sew this whole block together and show you what it looks like. Now it's time to make the plus block that's going to go in between those blocks I just made. Now I'm cutting out pieces of several different sizes, so what I've done is actually layered several of these pre-cut strips so that I can easily cut through several. But I'm going to keep the sizes in little piles so that I don't confuse myself as to which side is which is hilarious, because I probably am going to confuse myself, but just try to do it not as much as I normally would. Now I'm going to do the same with the prints, stacking them up and cutting out the sizes. Now it's time to start building my block by sewing these strips all together. So I'm gonna start with the smallest bit of the brown solid, and I'm gonna build up my block by using all the pieces that are already cut out. Now I love a scrappy quilt, don't get me wrong, but for this particular block, I do want the colors to kind of match up. It doesn't have to be that way. I think that might just be my little bit of OCD coming into the quilt. I don't think Grandpa would have cared either way. But I'm gonna take a 2.5 inch strip of the print and put it on the top, and then this other strip of the same print right next to it. So it's gonna make almost like a ring. And then I'll put a solid on the top, a solid on the side, and then when I go to do my next print, or my next ring of prints, I'm not gonna use these two because it already matches. I do want it to be a little scrappy, so maybe I'll do the green, which is just right beneath the pile, and that one will go on top, but I'll make sure I get the same one over here. And since all these are in order, I know exactly where to find that print. So as you can see, this is how it's gonna start coming together. Scoot that over, get a little scoochy scooch. Let me get this out of the way because I have one more ring of solids to add, which I already have cut out and piled together. So there, here. Now I still have all my prints nicely organized, so when I go to do the next block, I could just pull those right sizes out so that it does kind of make this ring right there. So basically I'm gonna sew it just like I laid it out. So now brown is not necessarily a color that I would pick, but I have fond memories of this brown quilt that we would have at Grandpa's house. And every time I would go over, I would sit on the couch and I would pull it on top of me, and it was brown and orange. And after he passed away, I actually got to keep the quilt. Now the actual quilt that's my absolute favorite, I still have it, it's actually on my son's bed. He loves it, but I've told him, I don't care how much you love it, son, you can't take it with you when you move out. I know it's mean, but it's kind of my special quilt. It's kind of nice of me just to let him borrow it, right? So now that the block is done, all I have to do is sew these cream-colored strips to the top and side. There is the finished block, but I actually need 4 of these to make the full-size plus block, but I just so happen to have them right here. And when in doubt, just make all the light strips come together. And see, there it is. There's the plus I was telling you about. Now I'm gonna have me a little sip, get these blocks all sewed together, so I'll meet you right back here in like 1 second. See, I said it would only take a second. Here is my finished cross block. Now I just have to sew a 9-patch block to either side of this to make the first row of my quilt. Whew, this quilt is finished, and what's great is since I have so many scrappy pieces of fabric, you can't tell where the points don't match. No fair looking either. Now it's time to quilt. Now before I get started, don't forget that I have all the diagrams for the quilting designs that I'm going to use on this quilt so that you can see exactly what I put in what area of the quilt. And you can also decide, do you want to turn in early with an easier design or stay up all night, working with something with a few more steps. So I'm starting out nice and easy to work me into the quilting, and I'm going to use the walking foot. That means the feed dogs are doing most of the work and pulling the quilt through as I'm quilting. Now what I'm going to use is these blocks as reference points, and I'm just quilting from one corner to the opposite. Kind of like a long diagonal line that connects from point to point. Now when I get to the end of my block, I'm gonna stop, back stitch a little bit to secure my threads, cut, and then reposition my quilt and start a new line of quilting. Now when it's time to turn direction, I'm gonna stop with the needle down in the quilt, and I'm gonna lift the presser foot up and very, oh so very carefully turn that quilt. Now I'm going a different direction and can start quilting. For instance, when I get to the end of my row, I'm gonna reposition and turn 90 degrees, so I'm echoing the other side of that block. So since I want to do a little bit more on this quilt than just a straight line quilting, I'm going to switch out my feet to my free motion quilting foot. Now what's kind of funny about this is that if I had made this with Grandpa, we would actually be hand quilting it. When we made our first quilt, he taught me how to hand quilt, and I didn't learn to machine quilt until he talked my husband into buying me a long arm. That's right, I went from hand quilting to long arming. It wasn't until several years later that I went back and taught myself how to quilt on a sewing machine. I like to joke that quilting with a sit-down machine is my second language, but I still find it just as fun. So now that the free motion quilting foot is on, I'm actually quilting continuous curve, and it's a really fancy way of saying lines that arc from point to point. Now what's fun about this is it's perfect for these little squares. I can start at one corner, quilt a line that arcs out to the next one, and then continue all around the block going from point to point. Now when quilting several blocks in a row, what I like to do is actually quilt a serpentine line. Starting from one point, I'll quilt a line that kind of curves out, crosses the point, out to the other side, and back to the point. And once I get to the end of that, I can do the same thing in reverse so that now my serpentine lines are crossing at the points and coming back to where I started. When I'm ready to do my next row, I just quilt another curved line to the next block and then continue on. Now if I happen to find myself stuck, I don't worry about it because I can just travel along the edge of the seam and get to where I need to go next. Since this quilt has a bunch of little pieces, I'm going to get busy quilting continuous curves in all of them. I'll see you when I'm finished. This quilt, which is basically one big 9 patch, is finally finished, and I love how every time I look at it, it'll remind me of Grandpa. Isn't that what's so great about quilts? They not only keep us warm, but they remind us of loved ones that have influenced us so much in their life, and I know that Grandpa would be proud if he saw this quilt. You know what else he'd be proud of? If you subscribe to the Midnight Quilt Show, which you can do by clicking that box right down there. That way you never miss an episode. Until then, happy quilting!